The broker laughed before she finished speaking. That was the part Margaret Hale remembered years later. Not the sale, not the money, not even the look on his face afterward. The laugh. Short, dismissive, automatic. The kind people make when they've already decided you're wrong. Margaret stood beside the loading chute at Mason County Livestock Exchange holding a clipboard while cattle moved through pens behind her. The broker barely glanced at the paperwork. How many head? 40. Silence. Then, what kind? Margaret answered. The broker laughed immediately. Not because the cattle were bad, because they were different. That distinction mattered. His name was Harold Brakes. 20 years in the cattle business. Perfect hat. Perfect boots. Perfect confidence. The kind of man who believed experience and correctness were the same thing. Harold looked at the paperwork again, then shook his head. No. Margaret frowned. No. No. Long pause. Then, what does that mean? Harold smiled politely. The dangerous kind. The kind that isn't really polite. It means you're wasting your time. Silence. Absolute silence. Margaret stared. What? Harold folded the papers closed. Nobody's paying premium prices for those cattle. The answer irritated her immediately, because she'd heard variations of it for years. The Hale Ranch sat on rolling Missouri grassland where most producers followed familiar patterns. Conventional breeds. Conventional feed. Conventional management. Conventional thinking. Margaret didn't. That was the problem, or maybe the advantage. Depending on who was talking, the ranch originally belonged to her grandfather, Samuel Hale, a stubborn man with strong opinions and very little interest in doing things because everyone else did. One summer evening, when Margaret was 14, she followed him across a pasture filled with cattle. The sun sat low across the hills. Grass moved softly in the wind. Samuel pointed toward the herd. See anything? Margaret frowned. Cows. Samuel laughed. Yes. Long pause. Healthy cows. She looked again, then shrugged. They look normal. Samuel nodded. That's what everybody sees. Silence. Then, what do you see? He smiled slightly. Efficiency. At 14, that answer meant nothing. At 38, it meant everything. Because Samuel spent decades selecting cattle differently. Not for auction trends. Not for magazine advertisements. Not for industry fashion. For performance. Fertility. Forage efficiency. Calving ease. Longevity. Traits that mattered on grass. Not necessarily in sale catalogs. The herd slowly became unusual. Very unusual. Not flashy. Not famous. But productive. Exceptionally productive. The problem? Nobody paid attention. Especially brokers. After Samuel died, Margaret inherited the operation, along with 200 acres, a cow-calf business, and years of unconventional genetics. Most people expected changes. Instead, Margaret kept going, which confused everybody. One afternoon, Dale Harper leaned against a fence watching cattle graze. You know what your problem is? Margaret smiled faintly. Apparently, everybody does. Dale pointed toward the herd. Those cattle. Silence. What about them? They don't match the market. Long pause. Then, do they match grass? Dale frowned. What? Margaret pointed toward the pasture. Do they work? Silence. Then, that's not the point. Margaret smiled. Maybe it is. That answer irritated Dale immediately. As usual, years passed. The ranch survived droughts better than neighboring operations. Feed costs stayed lower. Veterinary costs stayed lower. Pregnancy rates stayed higher. But whenever sale time arrived, the same conversation returned. Again, and again, and again. Brokers wanted different cattle. Auction buyers wanted different cattle. Industry experts wanted different cattle. Everybody wanted the same thing. Uniformity. Margaret wanted profitability. Those goals weren't always identical. One winter evening, Emily Hale sat across from her at the kitchen table. Records covered every available surface. Calving reports. Weight records. Feed costs. Breeding data. Everything. Emily stared. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The charts. Silence. The charts. That means you're thinking. Long pause. Then. Yes. Emily sat carefully. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? Margaret pointed toward the records. Selling. Emily immediately looked worried. Selling the ranch. No. Long pause. The cattle. That didn't help much. Because cattle sales paid bills. And bills had become increasingly stubborn. The next morning, Margaret loaded records into her truck and drove to meet Harold Brakes. The broker listened for exactly 4 minutes before deciding he already understood everything. Never a good sign. Margaret explained performance numbers, feed efficiency, replacement rates, longevity, profitability. Harold barely looked interested. Then finally, Margaret, silence. What? You need market cattle. She folded her arms. These are market cattle. He shook his head. No. Long pause. Then, they make money. Harold smiled patiently. That's not what buyers want. That sentence stayed with her. Because it felt wrong. Very wrong. Buyers wanted profitable cattle. Didn't they? Apparently not. 3 months later, drought conditions hit neighboring counties. Feed costs surged. Many producers started selling cattle early. Prices weakened. Everybody grew nervous. At the co-op, conversations turned gloomy. Dale shook his head. Bad market. Rick nodded. Very bad. Another rancher sighed, thinking about reducing numbers. The room felt heavy. Then Harold walked in. People immediately started asking questions. Market outlook. Sale expectations. Price forecasts. Everything. Eventually Harold spotted Margaret. Then laughed. Still planning that sale? Silence. Margaret nodded. Yes. Harold shook his head. Don't. The room became quiet. Very quiet. Then, why? Harold smiled politely. Those cattle aren't worth hauling. Silence. Absolute silence. Several ranchers looked uncomfortable. Even Dale. Margaret stared. Long pause. Then, not worth hauling? Harold nodded. Yes. Why? He folded his arms. Because nobody's paying what you think. The room waited. Margaret waited too. Then Harold delivered the line she'd remember forever. You'd be better off staying home. Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Margaret stared at him for several seconds. Then calmly picked up her coffee. Finished it. Set the cup down. And stood. Dale frowned. Where you going? Margaret looked toward the door. Then back at the room. Then toward Harold. And smiled slightly. The auction. Behind her. The room remained silent. Because nobody knew it yet. But 40 head of cattle were about to change everything. The auction yard felt different that morning. Not because of the weather. Not because of the cattle. Because Margaret could still hear Harold Briggs' voice in her head. You'd be better off staying home. The words followed her all the way to the sale barn. 40 head stood quietly inside the pens. Strong cattle. Deep-bodied. Easy fleshing. Years of careful selection standing behind steel gates. Margaret walked through them one last time. Checking tags. Watching movement. Watching attitude. The same way her grandfather always had. Dale Harper found her there. Naturally. He stood beside the fence. Hands in his pockets. Long silence. Then, you came. Margaret smiled faintly. Yes. Dale looked toward the cattle. Then back again. Still think Harold's wrong? Long pause. Then, I think numbers matter. Dale frowned. What numbers? Margaret pointed toward the herd. Those numbers. Because unlike most producers, she tracked everything. Every calving season. Every breeding cycle. Every feed expense. Every veterinary bill. Every pound gained from pasture. Every dollar earned. While other ranchers discussed market opinions, Margaret studied records. The difference mattered. The sale started shortly after noon. Pens moved steadily. Cattle entered. Cattle exited. Prices rose. Prices fell. The usual rhythm. The usual noise. The usual expectations. Then Margaret's cattle entered the ring. And something strange happened. The buyers stopped talking. Not completely. Just enough. Because experienced buyers notice things quickly. Frame. Muscle. Condition. Structure. Uniformity. The cattle looked different. Not dramatic. Not flashy. Just functional. The auctioneer started. Opening bids arrived immediately. Then another. Then another. Margaret folded her arms quietly. Dale stood nearby. Watching. Waiting. The first pin sold above expectations. Not dramatically. Just above. Dale frowned. The second pin sold higher. Then the third. Then another. The room started paying attention. Because buyers weren't behaving the way Harold predicted. One commercial buyer leaned toward another. What are those? The second man shrugged. Don't know. Long pause. Then, good cattle. That sentence spread through the crowd faster than expected. Because experienced buyers trusted performance. Even when they didn't understand the story behind it. The bidding intensified. Pen after pen. Lot after lot. Every group sold stronger than expected. Then stronger still. Margaret remained quiet. Mostly. But internally, something felt different. Very different. Because buyers weren't purchasing appearance. They were purchasing results. And somehow, they knew it. Halfway through the sale, a rancher from Kansas approached. Gray hat. Weathered face. Serious expression. He looked toward the cattle. Then toward Margaret. You raised these? She nodded. Yes. Long silence. Then, how long? Years. He nodded slowly. I can tell. That answer stayed with her. because it sounded exactly like something Samuel would have said. By late afternoon, the sale ring buzzed with conversations. People checked catalogs repeatedly, asked questions, compared notes. The same cattle Harold dismissed were attracting attention from buyers across several states. Then the final numbers started arriving. Margaret looked down at the paperwork, then blinked, then looked again, because surely she'd read it wrong. Surely. The total sat there clearly. 40 head. $318,000. Silence. Absolute silence. For several seconds, she simply stared. Dale leaned over, then froze. No. Margaret looked up. Yes. No. Yes. Dale grabbed the paperwork. Read it himself. Then again. Then one more time. Because apparently disbelief required verification. 318. Margaret nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then. That's impossible. She smiled slightly. Apparently not. The story spread through the county before sunset. Of course it did. Small towns move information faster than telephones. By evening, people already knew. By morning, everybody knew. By noon, people started pretending they believed in the cattle all along. Funny how that works. The most uncomfortable conversation happened 3 days later. Margaret walked into the co-op. The room immediately went quiet. Not completely, just enough. Because everyone knew the numbers now. Everyone. Dale sat beside Rick. Harold stood near the coffee counter. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Harold cleared his throat. Well, Margaret looked over. Well, long pause. You had a good sale. The room waited. Because everybody knew that wasn't really what he wanted to say. Margaret nodded politely. Yes. Silence. Then, Margaret surprised me. That was as close to an apology as Harold Briggs had ever come. Margaret considered helping him, then decided against it. Instead, she smiled. Margaret didn't surprise me. The room became very quiet. Because suddenly everyone remembered something. Harold looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Meaning what? Margaret set her coffee down, then looked around the room. At Dale. At Rick. At Harold. At every person who spent years explaining why her cattle were wrong. Then answered calmly, meaning I tracked them. Silence. Nobody spoke. So she continued. I knew feed costs. I knew fertility rates. I knew replacement costs. I knew longevity. I knew pasture performance. Long pause. I knew what they were worth. The room stayed silent. Because deep down, everyone understood. Margaret wasn't guessing. Never had been. She wasn't following trends. Wasn't chasing opinions. Wasn't buying magazine advertisements. She simply knew her herd better than anyone else, including the broker. Over the next few years, things changed. Not overnight. Gradually, other ranchers started asking questions. Real questions. About forage efficiency. About longevity. About profitability. About records. The same things they'd ignored before. Some even visited the Hale Ranch, including Dale. Frequently. One autumn evening, he stood beside Margaret overlooking a pasture filled with cattle beneath golden sunset light. Wind moved softly through the grass. The herd grazed quietly below. Dale folded his arms. You know what still bothers me? Margaret smiled slightly. What? He pointed toward the cattle. I laughed. Yes. No, seriously. Long pause. For years. Margaret looked across the pasture. Then toward the horizon. Then back again. Lots of people did. Dale nodded. That's the problem. Silence settled over the pasture. The sun slipped lower. Long shadows stretched across the hills. For years, people looked at Margaret Hale's cattle and saw a problem. Too different. Too unconventional. Too far from market trends. Then 40 head entered an auction ring, and buyers saw something completely different. Performance. Efficiency. Profitability. The things that actually mattered. The broker looked at her cattle and saw what everyone else expected. Margaret looked at them and saw what they actually did. And in the end, one opinion sold coffee shop conversations. The other sold 40 head for $318,000. After that, she never called Harold Briggs again.